after the heroine in the Bible that she represents. To all the leaders, to all of you who came out of your homes on this holy Sabbath day, I thank you for being here. Although I am a rabbi, I'm going to speak today more from my role here as a resident of Bethlehem, where I'm a professor of history at Northampton Community College. And one of the courses that I teach there is a course on Black history and civil rights. And one of the things I learned in that process is that many people who didn't live during that age do not fully understand and appreciate the lessons that it should teach us today. So in the few minutes allotted to me, I want to make 3 points about power, about guilt, and about responsibility. And looking at it from the perspective of a lot of the people we honor whose signs are here. The last time I stood at this spot with these people in that building was to honor the life of Dr. Martin Luther King. And what we fail to understand often as we idolize him, as the great man that he was, is to fail to appreciate that he was a great thinker. He was a great strategist. And he was effective because he was able to apply his ideas to his times and to actions. One of the things we often also don't remember about Martin Luther King is that he didn't just come up with this idea of nonviolent direct action. He had to arrive at that position. As a young man, he said, I believe that love was a good personal philosophy by which you should live your life as an individual. But he doubted whether it would work as a political strategy. His life as a young boy in Atlanta, Georgia in the 1920s taught him that might makes right, that those who have the power determine the rules. And so he was very suspicious of the ability of love, which he always had in his heart, and of justice, which he believed belonged to those who were oppressed, whether that was effective. And it wasn't until early in his adult life in college that he began to study from his Christian perspective the theologies of love as effective strategy. And then he learned about Mahatma Gandhi, who was his idol and his example. And he saw how Gandhi was able to use these nonviolent tactics in India against British colonialism and bring about freedom for his people non-violently. And so this taught him that this strategy can work. It is proven to have worked in other places. And if it could work in India, it could work in America, it could work all around the world. So he wasn't naive. He wasn't just an idealist. He had a strategy, he had proof, he had evidence of how it worked. And then he studied it theologically. And what he wanted to call it, he called it nonviolent direct action. He actually didn't like the term pacifist. People call a lot of you pacifists. And what he didn't like about that word is it sounded passive. It sounded like you weren't doing anything. And so he preferred an active verb, nonviolent direct action. His hero, Mahatma Gandhi, he called it satyagraha, which meant soul force. This is a force. We are empowered here today. We are exercising power, which is my point. This is powerful. Now, I encourage you to read his first book. It said King is a Hero. People all know his name. They probably heard that after James' speech. But very few people actually read his books. His first book was called Why We Can't Wait. Why We Can't Wait. It had a sense of urgency. We can't wait any longer. Just like many of you are saying, we can't breathe anymore. His first book is We Can't Wait any longer. And the first essay in that book, actually it might not be the first one, but one of the essays in that book is his letter from the Birmingham jail. And what I wanted to say about that is he wrote that letter from a prison cell. And he's sitting there in jail being arrested for having engaged in a nonviolent direct protest. He's arrested and he's in jail. He's sitting there in jail and he's reading the local newspaper. And in the newspaper was an editorial written by the local religious and political leaders of Montgomery, Alabama. And what they said in that letter is, Dr. King, we appreciate and we respect what you're trying to do. And we know that our community is not perfect, and we know that our country is not perfect, but what you're doing and the way you're going about it is completely wrong, and it's stirring up problems, and you're creating more discontent within the society. And so it was a respectful but blistering criticism of King. And he said this disturbed him more than the sheriffs, more even than the police dogs and the fire hoses. Because when you get criticism from racists, that is people who embrace it, people who are unapologetic about it, in a sense you could understand it. But when people of good conscience, people who are intelligent and seem to want the same things in society, when they fail to act and when they criticize people who are acting, this is really the problem. And King said, to them, what we have to understand is that we are all responsible. That there is a problem. He laid out 4 steps, and I see a lot of young people didn't live through that. He said the first step before you engage in nonviolent direct action is you have to do your research. You have to be sure that injustice exists. And so he said, did injustice exist in Alabama in 1963? It did. The second step, you have to engage in negotiation, to sit down with people and talk to them. That's the second step, but that's not the last step. If you sit down with people and you talk and you have these nice meetings, and you have breakfasts, and people make good speeches and they go home and nothing happens, this is the problem. So if you have these nice speeches and you have meetings and you have rallies and everybody says all the right things, if nothing happens, then you go to the third step. And the third step was called self-purification. Self-purification, and this is the step before actual action. And he says the reason self-purification is important, once you are sure that injustice exists, and after you have exhausted the methods of trying to talk and negotiate and have peaceful conversation, then you have to examine yourself one last time before you begin to take action. And make sure your motives are pure, make sure your reasons for doing this are right and just, because people could be gravitated to a movement for a lot of other reasons. Maybe people just want to, get their pictures in the newspaper. Maybe they just want to be seen on television. Maybe that's a place to go to meet pretty women or pretty boys. Maybe you just hate white people. Maybe you just want to engage in mayhem. So therefore, if you are sincere, search your heart and your soul and make sure your motives are right for why you wanted to do this. And then fourthly, once you've gone through those 3 steps, then you engage in nonviolent direct action. And what he said, it creates tension. Tension, just getting close to someone, just standing in front of a store. You don't have to burn it down. Just walk in front of it carrying a sign. And it causes people to think, and he asks, why are those people out there? Why are they marching? Why are they picketing? Why are they protesting? And that's exactly what we want them to do. We want them to start asking questions. We want them to start thinking. People who live there, because they won't hire black people here. Black people aren't allowed to try on clothing here. Black people are discriminated in this community. They're not allowed to use the bathroom, not allowed to drink from the water fountain. And people who lived in that community and see these white-only signs all their lives never thought about, now that you're standing here, now it forces me to think about it. And so what King understood is that people are naturally good, but good people are reluctant to act unless they are forced to, unless they are required to. So once you present it to them and they can't escape it, they can't avoid it because you're standing right there. You're holding up a sign in front of their face. Now you have to face it. And once you are forced to face it, good people will ultimately do the right thing. But until they are forced to do so, they will not act. And finally, this is a sense of power in itself, because people who don't understand it like we do, they might think, oh, you didn't do anything, you were just marching around, holding up signs and singing songs and chanting because you lacked the courage to take up arms, or you lacked the courage to go out and fight physically. And so we have to understand that this is not a lack of courage. It actually takes more courage and more bravery to do this. And it is a stronger example of power. Let us not forget that. As I prepare to take my seat, I'll leave you with one other example, and this is from Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, as you know, in South Africa, he also started out and he wanted to use the same tactics of Martin Luther King in the beginning. But then there was an incident in South Africa called the Sharpeville Massacre. And this is when the police and the army opened fire, killing unarmed black people on the street. And after that, the African National Congress, they said, well, we're going to engage in modified acts of violence. We're going to attack police stations and military installations, and we're going to try to have modified military action as a way of liberation. And so then Nelson Mandela found himself in jail for 27 years. And as he sat in that prison, he wrote in his autobiography, then I realized the true meaning of power. Because as I sat there in that narrow prison cell, unarmed with no weapons, I recognized that there were millions of people all over the world who were coming out calling for justice, calling for freedom, calling for liberation, and he realized that is power. He saw cities and colleges and municipalities divesting billions of dollars, saying we will not do business with South Africa or any apartheid regime, and divesting billions of dollars for that cause. And he said, now that is power. And then once he got released from prison and he was elected president of South Africa, the ability to win an election, that is power. And so this is more power that can ever come from a gun or a bomb. And so that's why I want to say to you today, you have power. You are the power, and we can make a change. May God bless you and bless us.